Muslims in Norway are now establishing a masjid and dawah center to enhance the Norwegian dawah. If you donate to this cause, you will inshallah reap the rewards of thousands of Muslims coming back to Islam, and many of those will become du'at and invite to Islam. So click the link and donate now and share the video for extra reward. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you guys doing? And welcome on behalf of IslamNet, in fact, which is a Norwegian organization which aims to create bridges between Muslim and non-Muslim communities. They're doing some great work. We are joined with an esteemed, legendary, Professor Bart Ehrman. Many of you already know who he is, but if you don't know, I'm going to quickly tell you. He's has written or edited 33 books, including 6 New York Times bestsellers: How Jesus Became God, misquoting Jesus, God's Problem, Jesus Interrupted, Forged, and The Triumph of Christianity. Bart is James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he has taught thousands of students and won numerous awards. Bart's work has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Newsweek. He's appeared on National Geographic, CNN, BBC, NBC, Dateline, and many other places as well. How are you today, Professor?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thanks. Doing well.
I think many people will know who you are, especially from kind of our follower base, because of your kind of work and how it's had an impact on kind of apologetics, whether it's Christian apologetics, Islamic apologetics, or otherwise. Even new atheists reference your work. And so it's really a pleasure to have you on. I think the first question I'd like to ask you regarding your line of specialism is about the reliability of the New Testament. Okay. First and foremost, you came to a conclusion in your own life, in your own kind of development, that the New Testament is not reliable. Why did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, I did come to that conclusion. I started out as a very conservative fundamentalist Christian who believed that every word in the Bible was completely true, and that there were no errors of any kind, scientific, geographical, historical, anything. And over time, I came to realize that that wasn't right. And in part, it was because I recognized I was open to any point of view. But I came to recognize that in fact there are discrepancies and contradictions in the New Testament. Just say between the Gospels and their accounts of Jesus, or between what the book of Acts says about Paul, what Paul says about Paul, so there are discrepancies, and obviously if there are discrepancies, they both views stated can't be true. So the trick is, though, what does it mean to be unreliable? I mean, if you've got a friend who's giving you directions, and about 10% of the time they're wrong, you don't know if you can trust him or not. But it's not that he's like completely unreliable. It's just that you have to figure out when's he got it right and not. And that's how it is with the New Testament, especially. You've got to figure out where it's right and where there are mistakes.
And how can one figure that out in layman's terms? Like if now many Christians may be watching this and say, well, they object to this fact, and they believe that every word and every sentence of the Bible is in fact inspired by God, and that they believe in biblical inerrancy. They don't believe that there's any such thing as an error in the Bible. They'll be very much taken aback by what you're saying and say, we find it objectionable, in fact. So what would you do in order to prove to them that this is not the case?
Well, that, as I said, that's how I started out too. When I graduated from high school, I went to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, which is it's a bastion of fundamentalism, and I was completely sold for years that this is absolutely, there is not a word wrong in the Bible. It was finally when I started, I learned Greek so I could read the New Testament in Greek, and then I learned Hebrew so I could read the Old Testament in Hebrew, and I started really studying these texts very closely, and I started finding that there are discrepancies. I mean, Mark will say one thing and Matthew will say something else, and it's the opposite thing. And you don't know this unless you really look closely, but when you do that, then you see this. And so Yeah, how do you go about finding out what's right? Well, you do it the way any historian finds out what happened in the past. I mean, if you're talking about, Abraham Lincoln or the Emperor Constantine or whatever, Churchill, you have to. Historians look at all the evidence. They consider who's writing it. They consider how close it is to the source. They consider how many sources they have. They see if they're consistent with each other. They try to work out what most plausibly happened. And that's all you can do with the New Testament, too. You treat it like a historical source if you want to know what happened historically.
I mean, just a bit of my background. At one point, when I was actually auditing a course at the University of Oxford, doing on text criticism, it's not something I actually specialize in myself, but I did audit a text criticism course as part of my applied theology masters, and I knew for a fact that I was well over my kind of, people were on a different level. I mean, you have to have, like you said, language skills. And I think this is a specialism in and of itself. You need to have language skills. There were, polyglots, people that had many different languages under their belt. Like you said, Hebrew and Greek and sometimes other languages as well. And so I do really respect the level of work that comes into, your line of specialism. Someone has to learn these languages, and then manuscript kind of analysis and looking at trying to draw inferences from it and stuff like this. It really is the work of specialists. And you've been doing this for that many years. So obviously it was only then really when I started to realize how heavy this was in terms of being able to be a great text critic. It's not something that someone could just do in a year or two. It's something that one must actually dedicate a considerable chunk of their life. But I'm wondering why you decided to do so, because when I was looking at some of the videos about your story, you left Christianity because of this reason, from what I understand. But what kept you interested in this topic?
So I got interested in text criticism. So some people may not know exactly what that means. It doesn't really just mean interpretation of text. As you said, it has to do with manuscripts. With the New Testament, we have thousands of manuscripts, but they have many, many differences between them. And so since we don't have the originals, we have to look at these manuscripts to find out what the authors originally wrote. And so text criticism is not deciding whether what the authors wrote was true or not. It's just finding out what did they actually write. And it's not just the New Testament. It's every book from antiquity is like this. So every Shakespeare's like this, or Chaucer. I mean, everybody, all these books, you've got to figure out what the author wrote. So I got interested in that because I believed that the original words were inspired by God. And so I wanted to know what the words were, since we have all these manuscripts that have differences in them. So that's what got me going. What kept me going was somewhat different. I actually did leave the faith about 25 years ago. I stopped being a Christian, and it wasn't actually because of the scholarship. The reason I left the faith was not because I knew the Bible had mistakes, or I knew that for a long time, and I stayed a Christian for a long time, knowing that. What made me leave the faith was I got to a point where I just couldn't believe that there was a God who was in the world, who was active, a loving, powerful God who's active in the world, given all of the massive suffering that people experience. I just thought, I just don't believe it anymore. But then why do I continue being a New Testament scholar? I'm passionate about the New Testament. I'm passionate about the study of early Christianity. And largely it's because it is such an important historical phenomenon. Christianity took over the entire Roman Empire and became the religion of the Western world. Basically, I mean, the dominant religion of the Western world. And there's still more Christians in the world than anything else. It's like, whoa, it's really important. And the New Testament is at the very root of it. It's the foundation of it. And so it's important for me to understand what the foundation is and to try and teach other people what the foundation is, because most people really don't know. And so that's why I'm passionate.
Well, I mean, your work, as I've said, is not just applicable or relevant to kind of Christians. It's very much relevant to Muslims as well, because, as you know, in the Islamic faith, Muslims believe in Jesus Christ as well. And obviously there's competing narrative ideas as to who Jesus Christ was, in fact. And the main, I would say, the fundamental difference between the kind of Muslim faith and the Christian faith in this regard is that Muslims view Jesus Christ as a prophet and as a messenger, a prophet and a Messiah, but not as God or the Son of God. In fact, the Quran is very explicit that he doesn't claim to be a God himself. In fact, this is seen as a fabricated or some kind of a contrivance on the narrative. And really, the Islamic idea is that there cannot be someone, it's not intelligible or conceivable or pardonable for someone with a date of birth to be referred to as God anyway. So Jesus Christ will be disqualified from that perspective. But this is why there's a lot of interest, I think, from the Muslim community on your kind of work, because it's historical work that's being done, and many Muslims feel that kind of your vision of, or your conclusions, your historical conclusions of who Jesus Christ is more commensurate with at least the Muslim idea than it is with the Christian one. To what extent would you agree or disagree with that notion?
I would say that my views don't fit in well with traditional Christianity in a lot of ways. I wouldn't say that they line up well with the Muslim view. I mean, for example, I really do think Jesus was crucified, and that he really was dead and buried, so there are differences, and there are a lot of people identify as Christian who do not think that it's important to think that Jesus was physically raised from the dead, or that he is literally God. There are people who identify as Christian with those views, and so, for me, I don't get involved with the theological controversies because I'm not theological. I don't believe in God at all. And so I'm not interested in whether Jesus was the Son of God, because I don't think there's a God. But I am interested in the historical question. And, how was Jesus understood during his lifetime? This is this topic of this webinar that I'm doing on Sunday. Did Jesus think he himself was God? Did he think he was God? And I treat this as a historical question. Of course, on a theological grounds, Christians would say, yeah, well, of course he did. But my question is, how do you establish that if you're doing it from a historical perspective? Like, without faith, it's not that you're Christian or anti-Christian or some other religion. It's just like, just historically, how would you go about showing if Jesus thought he was God? And I think actually historians can say something about this that will be surprising to a lot of people.
So from once again reading your book, misquoting Jesus and other things, my understanding is that your conclusion is that Jesus Christ was a messianic prophet, right? That at least that what he claimed he was, not a god or necessarily the Son of God, but not a god. To what extent is that a true representation of your beliefs?
Yeah, I think it's interesting in the New Testament that Jesus does claim to be God in the Gospel of John. Yeah. Which is our final gospel. Mm-hmm. I don't think that the historical Jesus considered himself to be a divine being at all. I think he thought that he was a son of God, in the sense that he was specially chosen by God, and that I think Jesus really did think he was going to be the Messiah, the future deliverer, the future King of Israel. That is, after all, why they crucified him, for saying that he was the king of Israel. And so I think that that's historically right. But that the Messiah was not supposed to be a divine figure. The Messiah was a human, and prophets were humans. And Jesus certainly understood himself as a prophet and as a teacher, and probably as the Messiah, and a son of God, in the sense that other people were sons of God. I mean, the King of Israel was the Son of God. He's called the Son of God. And priests were sometimes, or prophets, they could be called the Son. And so I don't think that Jesus thought that, like, he existed before he was born, or that he was born of a virgin. I don't think that any of that's probably right.
Well, what I've read from you and also heard from you in some lectures and debates, and also in your books, is that you differentiate between the Gospel of John, as you just have now, which is obviously the latest edition, and then obviously the Synoptic Gospels as well. And you make this case, from what I remember from reading your books, that there has been a development to a higher Christology. And in John, as you've mentioned, it seems like the author of the Bible, you mentioned, believes that Jesus is actually divine, but that in the Synoptic Gospels, we're talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this is less prominent. Can you tell us a bit more about that development?
Yeah. So what I would say is that these four Gospels are all distinct from one another. They all have their own message, their own perspective on Jesus, and it's not necessarily that these perspectives are at odds with each other or contradictory. I mean, I think Matthew and Luke have very different views of who Jesus was, but they're not necessarily contradictory. But I do think that John stands out as they're all different, but John is probably the most different, and pretty much for the reason you're saying. My view is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and as your listeners know, they call those the synoptic gospels because they're so similar. They tell many of the same stories. Sometimes they tell them word for word the same. And so you can put them in columns next to each other and read them together because you can see them together. So that's what synoptic means. You can see them together. John has a whole different set of stories. And I think that all of these gospel authors, I think all of them think that in some sense, Jesus is God. But it's only in the Gospel of John that Jesus goes around saying things like, I and the Father are one, or before Abraham was, I am, or if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. These are quite amazing statements. But from early on in Christianity, Christians knew that John was different, and they usually called it the spiritual gospel, because rather than kind of the nuts and bolts of what he was doing in his life, it's more theologically oriented. And that's a view that scholars today confirm, and that I agree with. It does, though, and I think it's extremely valuable to Christians as a theological expression of who Jesus is. But my question is it historical in the sense that is this the kind of thing Jesus was saying about himself?
Yes, and the point that you make also in some of, once again, I'm referencing you a lot here because obviously you've consumed a lot of your material. And I advise a lot of people to do the same. I think your books are very lucid, very well written, very well structured, and actually accessible to lay people as well, which I think you do an effort in making that the case. But you also make this case that when you talk about synoptic reports and you talk about kind of comparing synoptic reports with other reports, maybe that of John or other books in the New Testament, that one of the things that really cast aspersion on the reliability of the Bible, according to you, was the fact that not only are there different variants of the Bible, but they were contradictory variants. So you have the same story here being reported in two different ways, and you have direct contradictions, which if you were to take both stories on prima facie value, you would have to bring forward some very unfeasible or inconceivable set of kind of scenarios in order to make sense of both of them together. To what extent is this articulation representative of your position?
Yeah, no, that is my view. If somebody believes in inerrancy, as a lot of people do, a lot of Christian evangelicals tend to believe that the Bible has no mistakes in it. It's very hard to show them that that's a problematic view, because if you're at that level, if you think that the Bible cannot have any mistakes in it, then if you're shown a mistake, then you just refuse to admit it's a mistake, and that you think either it can be reconciled in some way, or that there's something we just don't understand about it, or we have, and so that's fine. But that's how I was too. What really got me were not the big differences, like John has Jesus portrayed like this and Matthew like that. The big differences, kind of weirdly, you can explain. It's the little details that tend to get somebody. And in my case, it was just this tiny little thing.
Can you give us some examples of what you're talking about?
I'll give you the example that blew it apart for me. I didn't know it was going to blow it apart, but it was like a little chink in the armor. And so what happened was I was in seminary. I was in seminary, and I was taking a semester-long course on the Gospel of Mark, where we read it in Greek, we studied in Greek, spent the whole semester just studying Mark in Greek, and I believed that the Bible had no mistakes in it at the time. We had to write a term paper for the class. My professor was this very devout, pious Christian. He wasn't a fundamentalist, but he had a high view of Scripture, and so I decided to do this passage in Mark chapter 2, where Jesus' disciples are going through the fields eating grain on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees see them doing this, and they're all upset because it's a Sabbath. You're not supposed to be harvesting grain on the Sabbath, and they're doing that. So they tell Jesus to tell the disciples to cut it out. And Jesus says to them, look, don't you remember what happened in Scripture when Abiathar was the high priest? when David went into the temple and he and his disciples, they ate the showbread that was only for the priests. And he goes on to say, that the Sabbath is made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. And so it's okay, to satisfy your hunger on the Sabbath. And so he tells, so my paper though was on this little detail. He says that this happened when Abiathar was the high priest. Because in the Old Testament, when this happens in the book of Samuel, it's not Abiathar. It's his father, Ahimelech, who's the high priest.
Oh, yes.
So I wrote a 30-page paper showing on the basis of a detailed analysis of Mark's grammar that even though he said Abiathar, he didn't mean Abiathar. He meant Ahimelech.
Is that paper anywhere on the internet we can look at?
This big paper, my professor really liked it. He gave me an A on it. But at the bottom of it, he simply said, maybe Mark just made a mistake. And it's like, oh, that's easier than a 30-page grammatical explanation. God, maybe Mark just made a mistake. So once I said that, it's like I started realizing, there could be a little mistake. And then I found another little mistake, and then another. And pretty soon I started finding them all over the place. Oh my God. And so it kind of blew apart this idea that
sometimes, in academia and scholarship, sometimes we forget that the path of least resistance is sometimes the most
exactly
is the best and most convincing one. But I'll tell you, I'm not sure if you've kind of come across how this works, at least from an Islamic perspective, but there's two things which I think may be of interest to you in Islam. One of them is that one of the necessary conditions for revelation, according to the Quran, is that there are no internal contradictions. And this is very clear. So in the Quran, it's mentioned, in chapter 4, verse 92, that if this book was from other than God, there would have been in it, لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. They would have found in it many contradictions, inconsistencies. And so there's this kind of falsification challenge to try and find contradictions within the Quran as a means of disproving it, because had it not been from God, then this would be a problem. Now, with the hadith, which is, I think, more of a kind of open game on these kind of things, there's actually a very strict step-by-step process on if there are contradictions between hadith, what to do, and the harmonizing method. And in fact, one of the great scholars, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who's one of the great scholars of hadith, he mentions a 6-stage process. And he says, look, you first try and harmonize it, you do this, you do that, and if it's conceivable. By the end of it, what happens is just what you've said. You have to reject one and accept one. If there are two contradictory hadiths talking about the same event, one of them has to be rejected and one of them has to be accepted, because it's the impossibility of both of them being true, even despite the fact that both of their chains may be correct, because we have something called the chain of narration, where many different things have to be in line in order for the chain to be acceptable and for it to be historical. And for this reason, many people don't know is that the authenticated hadiths are much more few in number and compared to the inauthentic hadiths. So we have literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of hadiths, statements of the Prophet which have been rejected, have been seen as weak or unreliable, or mawdu', which is fabricated, or matruk, or there's different classifications. And a significant minority, or even you can say a minority, generally speaking, of those hadiths constitute what is referred to as the sunnah, which is the authentic hadiths and so on, notably in the books of al-Bukhari and Muslim and so on. So I do think that there's something to look at there if you're interested in maybe not text criticism, but the kind of the historical approach of Islam as a point of comparison, maybe to see.
Yeah.
Have you ever looked at that yourself and been interested in that?
I'm not a Quran scholar, obviously, but I would like to say a couple things about it. One is that it does seem to me that if a book is without contradictions, that has no bearing on whether it comes from God or not.
True.
And so it's not impossible for a human to write a book without contradictions, because many people do. And so I've had phone books that are inerrant, but I certainly don't think God gave them. Another thing is that I as a good Westerner who was raised in, without knowing it, was raised in Greek philosophical traditions, including Aristotelian logic. I agree that two contradictory things can't be true historically. But I will also say that that is a product of my education, and that there are some areas that Aristotelian logic does not apply. For example, if I were a Christian, I would still believe in quantum mechanics. But I mean, quantum theory, there are, I mean, it just does not work on the kind of logical level. And to say that it can't be from God, if I were a Christian, I'd say the world was created by God, and the quantum mechanics does not,
Yes.
they're contradictions. They're just part of the business. And so, so I would also say that the other thing
with that point, just to, I would agree with what you said about phone book. The phone book is always good. What it is usually, the way we kind of put this forward is that there's the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions. So the way we would put it is that it's a necessary condition for a book from God not to have contradictions. It's not sufficient for it to be without contradictions.
I know a lot of Christians who disagree with that, because that's an assumption about what kind of book God could write. And for example, I know theologians who would say, Christian theologians who would say that yes, Matthew and Mark contradict at this point, but it's because Matthew's trying to make this important theological statement and Mark's trying to make that important theological statement. And both theological statements are true, even if they're not both historical.
Yes. No, but then the question is, if it's both, I mean, we're talking more about people that take the high view of scripture and biblical inerrancy, rather than kind of Christian scholars that come afterwards and talk about for example, those who say, I'm not talking about. There are many.
If you hold to inerrancy, then the contradiction thing's a big problem.
Exactly. Not those scholars like Karl Barth. I was reading. It's got your kind of first name and his surname, but obviously he was talking about himself, the vulnerabilities of the Bible, and if you look at his kind of like his works and stuff, and many scholars in the Christian tradition have noticed this. We're not saying that all obviously all of Christianity is characterized by the fact that people believe in biblical inerrancy. Is typically evangelical belief system. But this is where I think the argument is most potent. Your type of argument.
Yes.
We would say our type of argument as well, because if you hold that everything in the Bible is inspired by God, the all-knowing one, that would suggest that if there are contradictions between two propositions on the same kind of event that's being referred to, then either God got it wrong, which is absurd, or that those who wrote on behalf of him got it wrong, which is more plausible.
See, I don't agree with that, because I think they could get it right theologically, but not get it right historically. My view, the reason for pointing out that you can be, the reason why I pointed this out about theologians isn't really to make a point about academics. It's a point of saying you can still be a Christian and not be a fundamentalist.
Yes, of course. Yes.
You mentioned the neo atheist, and it's, I think, one of the big problems with some of the neo atheist authors is they assume that
everyone's evangelical.
Yeah, if it's if you're not a fundamentalist, you're not a Christian. It's like, what?
Exactly.
Or like they think that all religions fundamental, Islam, Judaism, is like they have this whole thing about like it's, and no, I mean, most people religious are not like that. And so
I think you're right. But here's what I would say on this point, though. I mean, I think there's a reason why evangelicals talk about biblical inerrancy and they hold to it. And the reason is that if God is being fair with people, right, then the accessibility to guidance that the primary audience has to the revelation shouldn't be disparate from the accessibility of guidance to people that come in later generations, because then that would be an advantage of the prior people to the kind of later people. And then questions of, well, if God wanted me to follow guidance and the guidance itself is corrupt, then what kind of guidance is it? I think that Muslims would agree with that sentiment to a large extent, like the idea that if guidance is to be sent to a people, it needs to be complete and it needs to be preserved. And so from that angle, I understand where the kind of, if you want to call them that, fundamentalists or kind of evangelical Christians are coming from. The only problem, as you said, is, it's true to say that in Christianity, not all people are characterized by believing in biblical inerrancy. Like many Catholics, many different types of Protestants don't believe in it, and in which case they have an easier case to make when it comes to sorting out these contradictions, but then they have a more difficult case to make as to why God hasn't revealed his book in a preserved way such that we can all have access to it in a very similar manner.
Well, I know this is an important argument that apologists use for Islam. My view about this is, as somebody who is not either Christian or Muslim, is that that it doesn't make sense to me for humans to say what God has to do. If God wants to make a revelation, it has to be this, this, or that. It's got to be clear. It's got to be consistent. There cannot be contradictions. There cannot be manuscript problems. I mean, who says? God. I mean, you're talking about somebody who's beyond your imagination.
Well, so what we would reply to that, right, is that we would say, otherwise it would be indistinguishable from human speech. There has to be something within Revelation which distinguishes it from human speech, so as to act as an evidence.
Yes, I know that's your argument,
yeah.
But I'm saying, who says it has to be? You are.
No, if it's not, then the issue would be then that anyone can claim prophecy or prophethood, right? Anyone can claim prophethood.
Well, the Christians say that's what the Christians say Muslims are doing. They're just claiming things for themselves.
This is what we would say. We would say that in the past, prophets came. This is actually what Ibn Hajar said, the same scholar that I've mentioned before, the Hadith scholar. He said that in the past, prophets came with kind of visual miracles. So things like splitting the sea, we believe in that, right? So Moses came and he turned the stick into a snake and all this kind of. So they did that. And he said the difference between those prophets and those who came after, or the final prophet, who's we believe Prophet Muhammad, that he came with something that can be analyzable in our times. So if it didn't have that analyzable quality, then once again, in terms of evidentiary basis, it would be lacking. So let me put it in this way. So for example, if I was there at the time of Moses and I saw him split the sea, and then I go and tell my grandchild about that, my grandchild has a lesser kind of accessibility to that miraculous nature of splitting the sea than I do. And so therefore the evidence that prophets are meant to provide to evidence their prophethood would be disparate from me to another person. But if it's analyzable in a sense that you can distinguish it from human speech, and you can do so in all times and places, then from that perspective, it becomes something which anyone in any generation can look at and distinguish from human speech. So for us, just to kind of finish this point, there's two things. There's what we call necessary conditions, things like that there should be, because usually, in, like you've mentioned, not just Greek logic, but any kind of logical L1, propositional logic, that a contradiction is false. It's a false statement. And so the fact that it doesn't fulfill the logical criterion for truth, if something which does not fulfill the logical criterion for truth presents itself as God's words, or the words of the all-knowing one, that should have, and then God decides to punish somebody because they're not following it, it's less veracious than someone saying, well, actually, God is punishing someone for not believing in something which there are evidences of, both necessary evidences, as we mentioned, preservation and inconsistency, but then also the sufficient evidences. So prophecies, we believe in prophecies of the Quran, prophecies of the Hadith, things that will happen in the future, the Prophet told us about, and so on. Which you can read a book called The Forbidden Prophecies. I can't go into it now because this will de-scope the discussion. But things like that, which will act as sufficient conditions now to satisfy the probabilistic reasoning of a human being. Somebody in the 7th century can kind of look at that, and someone in the 20th century can look at that, and so this would be the argument that we would put forward.
Yeah, no, I know, and I don't buy it. I think that it's based on assumptions about what's necessary. And you might say that logic is logic, but logic is not logic. I mean, anthropologists have clearly shown that, in fact, in different cultures, what counts as logic in one culture does not count as logic in another. So somebody else could come along and say the necessary condition for truth is that it's revealed as soon as human beings appear on earth, because it is necessary that God always had the same truth. And if he doesn't always have the same truth, so it has to go back to Adam and Eve, or it's not true, because it's necessary for God to reveal it to everybody who's ever lived. So people could say all sorts of things about what's necessary, but they're just saying what their tradition has taught them, or what they, or what makes sense to them, or what is logical in their point of view. I share your logic, but the law of non-contradiction is not written into the nature of reality. It's written into our particular Western philosophical tradition.
I don't think it's specific to the Western tradition.
Where are you going to find the law of contradiction, the law of non-contradiction before? Greek philosophy.
Well, I mean, in terms of codification, right? I mean, I would agree that Aristotle maybe, he codified it in the Organon or something like that, and that's probably one of the first.
It's so much a part of us. We can't imagine somebody not agreeing with it.
Yeah.
But we can't imagine quantum physics either.
No, I agree with you. But the thing is, if we do this, what is referred to sometimes as logical skepticism, if we do this exercise, then unfortunately a lot of what you're doing and what I'm doing in our respective fields will collapse, because one of the presuppositions of any scientific or historical enterprise are these laws, the laws of non-contradictions, the laws of predictability, or whatever it may be. These things are mentioned. So if the inductive approach, like, when you're doing your work, you rely upon a select few or a select number of manuscripts and data that you can then generalize or make conclusion. But what I was going to say was, so this is where we would maybe disagree or agree.
Yes.
I will leave it to the kind of viewers to make their mind up on that. Going back on the Bible and tell us more about that maybe before we end, is I want you to tell me something about who, in your opinion, maybe put it in this very blunt way, who was Jesus Christ? Who, according to you, was Jesus Christ?
So I think Jesus was a completely human being. I think that he was he's from a little town called Nazareth. There's a small little hamlet. He was impoverished. He was probably a day laborer of some kind, and he was some kind of religious genius, I think, maybe with a charismatic personality. Who I don't think he was well educated. Probably wasn't educated at all, but he had a gift for insight into matters of religion, and understood that he himself had been chosen by God in order to proclaim that God was soon going to intervene in history to destroy all the forces of evil that are creating all the misery and suffering in the world. And God was going to bring in the paradise that the world was supposed to originally have. There was going to be a kingdom here on earth, and people would be raised from the dead in order either to be brought into the kingdom or to be destroyed for all time. And he thought this was going to happen very soon. He offended the authorities for a variety of reasons connected with his message, and they decided that he was a troublemaker, and they arranged for him to be crucified, and they executed him.
So practically everything we would agree with, except for that last bit there. But we do believe in a crucifixion of some sorts. Though the Quran, just on that point, states that it was basically like in shubbiha lahum. It was a crucifixion that was made to appear to them that was Jesus, but it wasn't actually Jesus.
Yeah.
I could actually talk to you about the crucifixion maybe some other time, because it would be another can of worms that we'd be opening. But that's the Islamic narrative. But on this note, I want to thank you very much for joining us. Tell us about the seminar that you got on Sunday.
So the seminar, people can sign up on Islam.net. And for it, you'll have the website there, and it's going to be dealing from a historical perspective. How do you know what Jesus said, and how do you know whether he called himself God, and what kind of evidence is there? Is there evidence for it? Is there evidence against it? And so for me, it's a historical question, because whether he called himself God or not, I don't think he was God. So it's not. So, but I am interested in the question: what did he think about himself, and how would you know? So I think it's for a Muslim audience. I think this would be very interesting, because it would be. It coincides with some important aspects of Islam. And for a Christian audience, it's really important, because if Jesus didn't call himself God, suppose he did not call himself God, that would not mean he's not God, right? I don't call myself a pain in the neck, but doesn't mean I'm not a pain in the neck.
Well, maybe your wife has something to say about that, huh?
But it would be interesting theologically for people to know if Jesus called himself God, and then they would have to decide what to do with that. So I'm just going to be looking at the historical evidence. What can you say, and what are the grounds?
Just before I let you go, I mean, on this point, you do differ with atheists, or kind of, I don't say atheists, but minimalists, let's call them, historians who don't believe that Jesus existed at all.
No, I don't agree with that.
So what would be what would be your strongest evidences to someone who's a skeptic of the existence of Jesus in the first place?
Well, I wrote a whole book on this called "Did Jesus Exist?" because
Yeah,
the evidence is so overwhelming. This is
yeah,
not a debated point among experts, whether they're atheists or agnostics or
right,
Christians or Jews. It's just like it's not. But there is this a loud group of mythicists who think Jesus didn't exist, and you just wonder how much evidence do you need? I mean,
right,
uh, so in my book, I go through we have all of these sources of information. I mean, you have these four gospels, but these four gospels are based on earlier sources that were all independent of each other. And
wow,
and you've got an author like Paul who personally knew Jesus' brother. and he personally knew Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. And it's like he's not trying to prove Jesus existed. He's just like Paul. It's like, if Jesus' brother didn't exist, you'd think he'd know it. If Jesus had a brother, you'd think his brother would know that he didn't exist. Yeah. So, anyway, so I think that I just think that it's not a helpful point of view, and that if you're opposed to Christianity, there are probably more helpful ways to go about it than to say that Jesus didn't exist. If I ever did, which I never would. I mean, I don't believe in attacking any other religions or discounting, but if I wanted to discount Judaism, or if I wanted to discount Islam, I wouldn't say, "Oh, Mohammed never lived." It's like, well, of course he lived.
yeah.
It doesn't mean I have to agree with him.
Exactly. This is exactly the point, and I think that it's good that you mentioned that, and you do give a weighting to extra biblical sources as well, don't you? So
I do. I think there's external evidence as well. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and you're always welcome to come and speak to us and exchange ideas. And if you want anything from us, about Islam or explaining the foundations of Islam. I mean, a lot of people know it already, but it's a very simple religion. We believe in one God, worship in one God, and Abraham, Moses, and Jesus to worship in him, one God. Not all of those prophets. That those prophets came to tell the people to worship in one God. And so that's where I think there is a kind of line of best fit, if you like, or a flesh that joins, where we believe what we agree on, because what we do agree on is that Jesus was a man and not a God. Obviously, you don't believe in God in the first place, but there is a flesh, and that's what many people, Muslim people, will be interested in your work, to either bolster their claims or at least to try truth seekers that want to see who was this Jesus Christ that the world is so fascinated with. But thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Vegard, and I'm a Norwegian Muslim convert. I cannot express how grateful I am for Allah to have guided me to Islam. In my country, there are no Islamic schools or dawah centers that fully operate in my language. A lot of the Islamic programs here are in Urdu, Arabic and Somali, and I don't understand these languages. We new Muslims need a place where we really can learn Islam. Alhamdulillah, Allah guided me to the dawah organization IslamNet, who helped me stay firm in my religion. We are now raising funds to establish a Norwegian masjid and dawah center that will educate our people about Islam in the Norwegian language. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Whoever builds a masjid for Allah, Allah will build for him a similar house in Jannah." If you take part in this project, you will inshallah be rewarded for all the new Muslims who learn about Islam and all of the Muslims who learn to give dawah, and every single person who accepts Islam through this center. This will inshallah be an endless ongoing charity for you. And let's not forget, Allah will inshallah build for you a palace in Jannah. As a Norwegian Muslim, Norway is my country, and dawah to these people is my responsibility. And you are my family. Please donate for the sake of Allah and build for yourself a house in Jannah. And whatever you give, Allah will give you more in return. And please click on the share button so you can get the reward of everyone who follows you in donating for this masjid. May Allah reward you.